Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight for our live telephone town hall event with Senator Rand Paul and our special guest this evening, Kentucky's 4th District Congressman Thomas Massie. I'll be here in the studio tonight moderating and handling your incoming questions. And if you have a question that you would like to ask either of them, you can press *3 on your telephone keypad at any time. We also invite you to participate in our interactive poll. You can vote anytime on your telephone keypad or on our website, paul.senate.gov/live, where this is being live streamed right now. Here's the question. Do you think local communities and counties are right to stand up for their Second Amendment rights by creating Second Amendment sanctuary counties? Press 1 for yes and press 2 for no. With that, I'll hand it over to Congressman Massie and Senator Paul. Now, Congressman, would you like to start us off, maybe talk about the topic of our poll question? I hear that this is a hot button issue up in your district.
It's very hot in the 4th Congressional District. First of all, let me describe what the 4th Congressional District is, since there are people all across the state of Kentucky, I think, who are in on this phone call. The 4th Congressional District includes northern Kentucky, which is Boone, Kenton, and Campbell counties, which are there near the Cincinnati area, but it also goes west to the eastern suburbs of Louisville. So Shelby County, Spencer County, part of Jefferson County, Oldham County are all in the district. And then if you go east, it includes counties like Lewis County and Boyd County, Greenup County. So it's 20 counties, and 14 of them border the Ohio River. That's sort of how you can keep track of it. So among those 20 counties, nearly all of them have passed a Second Amendment sanctuary county resolution. And some people have said, well, you know, the resolution, it's not an ordinance. Does it go far enough? Does it go too far? And I think it's just the right level for now. I've noticed that some of the magistrates and county judges executives are having a little bit of heartburn with these resolutions. And I think it's important to know where your local officials stand on the Second Amendment, because if they pass something like red flag laws, which have been discussed here in Congress and which I oppose, but if they pass something like that, it's going to be up to the local county officials to enforce it. The magistrates will pass the resolutions that fund it. They'll pass the budgets that fund the implementation of that, and the sheriffs would enforce it. And so I think it is important to know where your local officials stand on issues like red flag laws and things like that. I think it's a great movement. I support it 100%. I, in fact, went to Frankfort last weekend. There was a big Second Amendment rally, and even though it was raining and cold, there were like 500 people there. And a lot of enthusiasm.
We're seeing it across the state. We've got counties, probably 3/4 of the counties in Kentucky now have passed it. And I think it's a great example of having, expressing your will locally, but also for something, that people think, oh, that only happens in Washington or whatever, the Bill of Rights. And a lot of people don't realize that the Bill of Rights, for years and years, people weren't sure whether it applied to states and cities. And then I know you've been really interested in like the Heller Supreme Court case.
Yeah, we had Dick Heller, who won the D.C. versus Heller court decision in 2008, and that guaranteed it guaranteed that the federal government couldn't infringe on your right to keep and bear arms, that everybody had that right, unconnected with membership in a militia, because up until that point, people said it was a militia.
And basically applied the Second Amendment to the states then.
It applied it to the federal government, and then a couple years later, there was the McDonald decision versus Chicago that secured it in the states. It said basically the Second Amendment doesn't just apply to the federal government, it applies to the state and local governments.
And in the McDonald decision, it was just a regular middle-class guy who lived in a neighborhood with crime and he wanted to defend himself, right?
Yeah, and that's the case with Dick Heller. In fact, he was a special police officer. They would allow him to have a gun if he would protect, the constabulary in D.C., but when he went home, they said, no, you can't have a gun.
Yeah, that's kind of the craziness. I remember after 9/11, there was this debate over whether pilots should be armed. And it's like, oh no, it'd be too dangerous. And it's like, you trust this guy or this woman to fly 300 of you in this crate all the way across the country, and it's a miracle that you get there and it's so safe. And that guy's got a man or woman has to be that smart, but you don't trust him to only shoot the gun when he has to. And it's like, no, what you really need, and this is why one of the great things about guns is deterrence. Even policemen, most policemen go their whole career and don't shoot somebody, but the gun that they have on their hip is a deterrent. And the sign on the cockpit door should have always been, enter at your own risk, but we've got a Smith & Wesson on the other side. And so, I like the idea of guns as a deterrent. Our police, our sheriffs, when I travel around the district, up in your district or across the state, usually there's an armed sheriff or a deputy there, and we appreciate that support.
Well, the other reason these resolutions are important is not all of us went from eye doctor to Congress. Okay, some of us stopped at county judge executive for a while. So, for instance, I was a county judge executive, and I would have constituents ask me my position on the Second Amendment and on abortion, the pro-life issue. And I thought, well, this is kind of odd because I'm not sure that I'll be legislating on these issues at the county level, but it was actually smart for them because one day, eventually I ended up in Congress and they wanted to make sure they knew who I was at the local level. So it's important to know where your local officials stand on national issues.
Well, you want your sheriff to defend the Second Amendment. You want them to defend your rights. You want them to believe that life's important and a gift from God. And so I think it is important all across. And I'll never forget running early on up in northern Kentucky, one of the sheriffs coming up to me and saying, I said, "You're going to protect us against the federal government overreach." And he says, "Yeah, they're not coming in here unless the warrant's been signed by a local judge."
Yeah,
so,
warrants are important. And when I was a county judge executive, I didn't make it a gun-free zone in our courthouse. You could bring a firearm into the courthouse when you were paying your taxes, for instance.
Right. No, and this still is the discussion, not only whether pilots should be armed, to deter terrorists in the cockpit, but whether or not, an off-duty policeman ought to be able to carry their weapon on the plane. And I'm all for it because I do think that guns are a deterrent. And the more that terrorists know that people are armed on our planes, that there are often federal marshals, there's often police on the plane, deputies on the plane, and that they're armed in the cockpit, I just don't think there'll be as many. They did it because they thought they could get away with it. We had a tin door and nobody was armed on the plane. And so, unfortunately, it was too late, but I think we did learn our lesson and we do a lot better now as far as self-defense.
So I just introduced a bill. I haven't had a chance to show it to you yet, called the Safer Voter Act. It stands for Second Amendment for every registrable voter. And what this would do is would tie the age at which you can buy a handgun from an FFL to the age at which you can vote, which is also the age at which you can go to Afghanistan and carry an M4. I believe that if you're a single or a mother who's at home and your husband's deployed overseas, that you shouldn't be deprived of the ability to defend your family.
Right.
Because right now there's a federal prohibition for 18, 19, and 20-year-olds from buying a firearm from an or a pistol from a FFL. They can buy a rifle. So my bill would let them remove that prohibition at the FFL.
Well, and this
level.
has always been the argument, the crimes that are committed with guns. Is it the problem with the individual or is the gun somehow committing these crimes? And so much of it, as you read through, and it is heart-wrenching to read about the kids who died in the mass shooting, and I just finished reading a book about the Parkland shooting. But in there, this was just a really, really terrible kid. I mean, he was rotten to the core. They knew about him all along. And the school district just really failed. And the main thesis of this book, Why Meadow Died, this guy's daughter, was that the school district just mainstreamed this kid that was so terrible that they wouldn't let him bring a backpack in. They already suspected him. He probably committed like a half a dozen felonies, but no one would arrest him because there was federal money tied to not having an arrest record. And so instead of having 20% of the kids, the next year there were 3% of the kids arrested, and like, oh, I guess the kids all improved. No, they just quit reporting it because they get more money if they don't report how rotten some of these kids are.
So the lesson there is we don't need any more laws. Just need to pay attention to what we have.
I agree. Yeah, I mean, this kid was shooting the neighbor's animals. That's, discharging a weapon recklessly is a felony. All kinds of things like that he could have been arrested for. He'd made particular threats to people. And but I think we have to do something. We have to figure out a way to try to keep some of these rotten kids away from our kids. One of the things we've been working on, and I don't know if there's a House companion, but this is my chance to lobby you to see if we'll get a House companion
I just lobbied you on my bill there.
Is the Helper Act, and what we're trying to do is look at ways to make college more affordable. And so the two things I hear a lot from soccer moms, families, young parents with kids is how are we going to pay for college? It's so expensive, and how are we going to pay for high cost of drugs? And so with the Helper Act, we basically say you can pay for college with pre-tax money. Now, this is sort of an alternative to the so-called free college that, Bernie and AOC and Elizabeth Warren are all saying, oh, we'll give you free college. But the first thing people should know that are listening to this is there is no free lunch, there is no free college. Somebody pays for it, either through massive debt the country's already accumulating, or through higher taxes, or through inflation. But eventually someone has to pay for it. But in this sense, what it does is it basically just says you can keep more of your money. We won't tax the money that you have to save for college. And a lot of people now save through something called a 529 plan, but you have to save after tax. So if we were to do this Helper Act, basically college would be about 20 to 30% cheaper. So there's something you can think about if you want to get
I'll look at your
it in the
bill.
house. So
People don't realize we lobby each other here.
yeah, I always tell people after I hear them, they come to our office wanting something from government. And I said, well, now I got something I want to tell you about, So, but it is interesting. So, what are some of the other things you've been working on?
Well, the Second Amendment Caucus, which you've been helping me with.
Right.
I'm the chair of that in the House. But people don't realize you don't have caucuses in the Senate. And that's kind of an interesting difference between the House and the Senate.
Well, that's why I joined your caucus, so you would have to do all the work, and I just would come,
co-chair,
I would just
co-chair.
come over to enjoy the speakers. But no, Second Amendment is important, and when I first ran, I would tell people, you can't have the Second Amendment unless you protect the First Amendment, unless you protect the Fourth Amendment. You really need the entire Bill of Rights is a package, and you need one to support the other. You need the First Amendment, which means the ability to participate in campaigns and not be overly limited in who you give money to, or frankly, how much money you give to someone, in the sense that if you want to advocate for the rights of the unborn, or you want to advocate for gun rights, if we limit the First Amendment, the First Amendment, we'll lose the Second Amendment eventually. And really, if you want to be able to exercise your Second Amendment, you need to have the ability to be free of unreasonable search. The government shouldn't be able to come in your house, and if there ever were to be gun confiscation, it would be in violation of the Fourth Amendment. And so the Fourth Amendment is very important, that we not let government get so big that they're either listening to our phone calls or coming into our house without first going to a judge and asking for permission.
Totally agree.
You know what? We about ready to go to questions?
Yeah, well, one thing I wanted to do is see if you guys wanted to talk a little bit about what your offices can do for Kentuckians, because I know that there's been a lot of flooding in Eastern Kentucky. I'm sure that you get stuff in your district,
Sure,
the casework. Do you guys mind discussing that a little?
Yeah, like in Northern Kentucky, you could contact me if you have a problem with your veterans benefits, your Social Security, your Medicare, federal tax matters, and the IRS. Immigration, passports, by the way, legal immigration, not illegal immigration. We do military academy nominations twice a year. We have an event in the spring. We have an event where people can come and there are tables set up and learn about the various academies. And then in the fall, we have an interview panel where the high school students interview with people who've gone to the academy, and then that's how we do our recommendations. Federal student loans. We can also help you replace or find lost or damaged records, military records. If you have somebody who didn't get their medal, this is a tough one, like a veteran. And sometimes we've done these for people who've since passed away, and we've been able to find the evidence that they deserved a medal. And that's always a fun thing to do, give somebody their medal that they didn't give because they just wanted to come home and be done with the war, or to give it to somebody who, one of their relatives. So there are a lot of things we can do. I think one of the most popular things is helping people with their Social Security. There's a lot of red tape in the government. And what we can do is you call us up, and my caseworkers you'll sign a privacy release if you trust them with your information, and then they can advocate for you on behalf of you with the Social Security Administration. And the great thing is they can't just put you off for months if they're dealing with a congressman. So I love helping people with those issues and cut through the red tape.
And how do Kentuckians get in contact with you for that?
The best way is to call my district office in Kentucky. That's where my caseworkers are. And you can call 859-426-0080. And if you call that number, they'll help you. If you just find one of my other numbers in there, we'll get you to that number. But that's where all the work happens, is down there in Kentucky. And they've got the IRS on speed dial, they got the VA on speed dial. They can take care of these issues.
Wonderful. And Senator, do you want to tell everyone how to get in contact with us?
Yeah, sure. And if you're just joining in on the phone call or watching this online or Facebook, I'm with Thomas Massie tonight. He's a congressman from Northern Kentucky, up near Cincinnati and all the way over to Ashland. And we're talking about issues. We're going to take questions in just a few minutes from the phone and computer. But my office does a lot of the same thing that Congressman Massie's office does, taking care of veterans, taking care of people who have any kind of interaction with government. And if you want to get in contact with us, you can dial the number, which is 270-782-8303. You can also get us online at www.paul.senate.gov. And if you're interested in asking a question, if you'll hit *3 on your telephone, we're getting ready to start some questions. Do we have anybody up for questions yet?
We have lots of questions. People are so excited. And another quick reminder, we do have a poll going on. And the poll here is, the question is, do you think local communities and counties are right to stand up for their Second Amendment rights by creating Second Amendment sanctuary counties? You can press 1 for yes and press 2 for no.
This is a really hard question. I'm wondering if you press 2, if you get automatically rejected from the phone call.
Well, no, I don't think that. I think we get in trouble if it worked that way.
All right.
Okay, so we have some great questions coming in. Let's go ahead and go to our first one here. This is Miss Glenda Baker from Lexington. All right, Glenda, you are live with the senator. Go ahead and ask your question. You're also live with Congressman Massie. Oh my goodness. Go ahead and ask your question.
Good evening to both of you.
Good evening.
My question has to do with the destruction of the educational system since 1979 that has resulted in our kids begging for socialism and communism. And so what can we do to get that knowledge out? Because we can't take over the schools right away. But that information needs to be out there right now.
No,
I know PragerU does videos, Hillsdale does stuff, but the message is not hitting hard enough.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question, and I'll start out with that because, see, Thomas was probably just a baby and doesn't even remember 1979. But
8 years old.
In 1979, what happened is we basically got the Department of Education, or right around that time. In fact, that's what Ronald Reagan ran on. One of his main parts of his platform was he was going to get rid of the Department of Education. And there still is no need for a Department of Education in Washington. Education was typically a state issue. Your local property taxes still pay for most of your schooling. But the more it became federal, the more it became centralized, the more, that you got a curriculum that was controlled by a few people, the bigger danger there was that ultimately you'd have a curriculum that was pro-big government and a curriculum that was against capitalism, liberty, and individual freedom. And so that's what's happened over time. And so you end up getting a curriculum that probably speaks highly of Marx and socialism. And that's what we've got. Now, they guise it in different terms. They call it fairness. But I'm very concerned about this. My wife and I just finished a book last fall called The Case Against Socialism. And in it, we talk about sort of the inevitability of violence, starvation, famine, what we saw throughout the 20th century with socialism. And we're trying to warn this generation that there is no benign, kinder, gentler socialism like Bernie promises. If they say there's going to be an election, usually there's one and they're done. But socialism is not a good thing, but really centralization of education is not a good thing. Do you hear this question much, Thomas?
Well, this is a great opportunity to talk about the difference between the Senate and the House. You confirm the presidential nominations, and in the House we don't deal with confirmations. But I had a lot of people who wanted me to oppose the confirmation of Betsy DeVos as the Secretary of Education. And we had to tell them on the phone, I don't vote on that. Senator Paul and Senator McConnell do. But people insisted that I oppose Betsy DeVos, and I thought, what they really mean to oppose, I think, is the federal control of their local education. And so I introduced a bill the day you were voting on whether or not to confirm Betsy DeVos. I introduced a bill that's one sentence long that says the Federal Department of Education shall terminate on December 31st, 2018. Now, that bill didn't pass, so I've reintroduced it, and the deadline now is December 31st, 2020. But my point there is not that I don't like public education. I went to public schools in Kentucky, so did my wife. We love our teachers. All 4 of my children went to the same public school in Kentucky that my wife and I went to. But, I started school in Kentucky before there was the Department of Education, and certainly even when I was in middle school, the Department of Education hadn't grown to the size it is today, and teachers were still teaching what they knew needed to be taught, and there was still more control locally over the curriculum. And I feel like it was better back then, the part of the education that I got that was less controlled by the federal government. And teachers, I trust the teachers. I want to give them flexibility in Kentucky, and also the school boards, which are just elected citizens, to decide what and how the kids should learn, not the federal government.
I think that's one of the unstated things about the Department of Education is you get all these bureaucrats and you get Washington telling local teachers how to teach. And I'm with you. I think we have a better chance having local teachers in Kentucky decide the curriculum. But the other thing I would add into that is not only local control, not federal control, but I think school choice is a good idea, whether it's among public or private school. Basically, if you pay property tax and you pay $3,000 a year, you should get a piece of paper and you should get to take it where you wish. And I'd include all schools, public, private, religious, you name it.
Homeschooling.
Yeah, homeschooling actually as well. And I think that would make a big difference because competition makes us all better. And really, in the end, those who have means and who have money find ways around it if their public school is bad. But I'm kind of like you. I went to public schools all the way through high school. You know, my high school had calculus, physics, chemistry too. I mean, I had anatomy and physiology. We did dissection in high school. I mean, we really had a good high school. And it was a public high school. But there are some, particularly in some of our cities, even in Kentucky, that are failing the kids, that have gotten failing grades from all of the organizations that look at schools. And if you're a poor kid in the poor part of town, you should be allowed to take your voucher and hightail it out to the suburbs and go to a better public school. That would make the schools all get better to compete for your voucher, basically.
I agree.
All right, ready to go to our next question?
Sure.
Okay, Patrick Green from Vine Grove, Kentucky. Go ahead, Mr. Green. You are live with Senator Paul and Congressman Massie.
Good evening. I would like to know what the senator's plan, and also the representative, although Guthrie is my representative, what the plan is to get our troops out of the longest war in our history. I'm a retired combat infantryman, and I have a son who's a captain in the armor. Thank you.
Patrick, great question. And last night I was with the president at Dover Air Force Base. It was a very somber and sad affair, but 2 of our young men were killed in Afghanistan this week and were brought home. I can't tell you how much it hurts me to see this happen, and particularly since I think the war in Afghanistan is well past time of anything really productive coming from it. I don't think there's a mission there anymore. So I've been a long supporter of bringing the troops home. I've introduced resolutions to bring the troops home. I'm absolutely 110% in favor of it. I held hearings today called the Afghan Papers, where we discussed the generals and the colonels and all these high-ranking officers who have now been saying for years that we don't have a mission, we don't have a clear-cut mission. Our original mission, I agreed with. The people who attacked us on 9/11, we should have gone after them and punished them, disrupted them, and make sure they could never attack us again. We did that in the first 6 months to a year of the war. And now we're trying to create a nation for them. We spend $50 billion a year over there. I really think that money needs to be spent here at home. I'm all in favor of our soldiers, but I'd like our soldiers to be ready and prepared in case someone attacks us and we have to defend ourselves. And I think our soldiers want to defend our country, but I don't think they want to be policemen in Afghanistan and all over the Middle East. This is something President Trump and I, have an agreement on. I think Congressman Massie and I see largely alike. What do you think about the war, Thomas?
Well, I talked to President Trump a couple weeks ago about this too, and he wants to get us out of Iraq. He wants to get us out of Afghanistan. I'm known for being anti-war. He said he was more anti-war than me, and I believe him. He had the troop numbers down to 5,000 in Iraq. I have co-sponsored legislation with Barbara Lee, who is a Democrat. I was able to cross the aisle to co-sponsor repeal of the Iraq AUMF. And I think that's important.
This is the authorization.
Right. AUMF stands for Authorization of Use of Military Force, that was passed in Iraq in 2002. And it turns out that only 15% of the people serving in Congress right now even voted on that. 85% of us have never had a vote on what our mission is in Iraq, and this is what I've said in my speeches on the floor in support of repealing the AUMF. By the way, maybe we still need to be there a little bit longer. If you believe that, go to the floor and debate it and give the troops a mission that they can accomplish so that when they do accomplish it, you bring them home. But we really do owe it to our soldiers to have that debate. And that's what I talk about on the floor. I think it's really important. Give them a mission. They're very competent, far more competent than Congress.
Right.
I mean, that's a low bar. But and let them accomplish that and come home. But thank you, Patrick, for your service, and thank you for your son. Thank your son for his service.
Absolutely. And one of the additional things on it that people don't seem to realize is that the Constitution mandates, not that we have a conversation or someone asks for our advice, they're supposed to ask for permission of Congress. Congress is closer to the people. There's a lot of us, and we represent a lot of people. They're supposed to ask for permission before they go to war. And so Congressman Massie and I are in the middle of all this, trying to make sure the Constitution is enforced, that you don't go to war without permission. And this is something I feel very strongly about, and I think we'd be in less war, frankly, if we obeyed the Constitution. And really, we have soldiers now serving who were born after 9/11. And they're still fighting in a war that we never have reauthorized. We've never debated again. And really, I mean, you can't find a general who will tell you what the mission is over there. That means it's time to be home. And it's very, very important to me and something I work on every day to see if we can try to end this, forever war.
Just to put that number in perspective that you mentioned, Rand, the $50 billion that we spend in Afghanistan every year, that's the entire Highway Trust Fund. Like, if you take all of the money that we spend at the federal level on roads and bridges, all the interstates and all the bridges in this country, it adds up to about $60 billion, and we bring in $50 billion, so there's a $10 billion deficit. But you could double that. You could double the spending on our infrastructure if you took the money we're spending in Afghanistan, and we're building infrastructure there. Like, John Sopko, he's the Inspector General over all the spending on Afghan reconstruction there. We spent $132 billion just building their infrastructure and paying for their government. That doesn't include the war.
I've yet to meet a Republican, a Democrat, or an independent in Kentucky who doesn't think, let's spend that money paving roads and bridges in our country, not in Afghanistan. I mean, I think people are in unanimous agreement on it. I have one other bill, so I'll lobby you on another bill. This one's called the Penny Plan for Infrastructure. And what we do is we take all of the spending and we cut 1%, because I think there's 1% waste throughout the whole government. Make them be more efficient, cut the 1%, and that's only about $12 billion, but then we put it into an infrastructure fund, and that's about 5 or 6 Brent Spence bridges, $12 billion. So there's a lot that could be done. Plus, I think some people up there want another bridge out on the east end. You could probably put 2 bridges across the Ohio and 5 more bridges with that $12 billion.
Every year.
Yeah, every year. And what we do, and it would also have the secondary benefit of making everybody else be more efficient with their spending by cutting waste.
Man, this is great conversation. I'm excited about all this. Okay.
But I've got to go back and read like 3 more bills now.
Yeah.
I can barely keep up with the bills in the House. I mean, we had a 6,000-page NDAA that they gave us 18 hours to read. Now Rand's given me 3 other bills to read.
Anything over 50 pages probably has more mischief than good in it.
Anything over 50 pages, we'll probably tweet a photo of him reading. So let's go ahead and go to our next question. Steve Atkins from Bowling Green. Go ahead, Mr. Atkins. You're live with Senator Paul and Congressman Massie.
Yes, gentlemen, every person we send to Washington promises us they will lower the national debt. Yet it looks to me like it's going in the wrong direction, and I'm not seeing much action to lower it with this next budget coming up. And that's my question.
Steve, I think that's a great question, and you're exactly right to be exasperated, mad, hacked off, disappointed, and I join you in that. I ran on trying to make the deficit lower. Now, the only thing I will say is I do vote that way. I don't vote for any of the big budgets that are unbalanced, whether the Republicans put them forward or the Democrats put them forward. I've introduced my own balanced budget plan. It's called the Penny Plan, and it cuts 1% from government spending every year for 5 years and does balance the budget. So I've voted repeatedly for a balanced budget. I just don't win. But the reason I don't win is there's not enough good people. Now, Thomas is one of about a handful, maybe 20 or 30 in the House that are conservative and vote for balanced budgets. And I'll let him speak for himself. But I do vote to cut the money. And the other thing I'll add to this, and I'll turn it over to Thomas, is there's people on the right and the left that are the problem. Some on the right want unlimited checks to fight foreign wars in Afghanistan and build roads in Afghanistan. And some on the left want more social programs at home. We can't have unlimited checks on the right or the left. Unfortunately, they do compromise, and both of them spend money. So it's a minority of us. There's about 15 to 20 Republicans in the U.S. Senate that are for balanced budgets and will vote for it. The rest of them are big government Republicans and not a lot different than Democrats as far as spending goes. But I do work hard for you. I try very hard to balance the budget, and I've always voted that way. I've never, ever voted for an unbalanced budget.
Well, I've been called Mr. No because I vote against so many continuing resolutions, omnibuses, debt limit increases. In fact, I voted no on all of those, so people call me Mr. No. Some people say, well, you should spell it K-N-O-W because he knows what's in those budgets. That's why he doesn't vote for them. But I tell people, if you can find evidence that I have voted too frequently to cut spending, if you find evidence that we're not spending enough, let me know, and I'll quit voting no on these spending bills and these budgets. Now, one of the things that they do here in the House to sort of placate voters that isn't for real, it's sort of like a pretend activity, and don't shoot the messenger here, is they like to pass this thing called the Balanced Budget Amendment, but they know it will never pass the Senate and get signed and then ratified by the state. So they're not worried. They bring this up and they pass it. Well, last year, they brought the Balanced Budget Amendment up 4 days after they just busted the budget. And I thought they had a lot of gall, and they said, well, there was part of that Balanced Budget Amendment that said, well, if 60% of the House votes to break the budget, then they can break the budget under this Balanced Budget Amendment. So I went back and looked 4 days earlier, 61% of the House had voted for the bad budget. Right. So the Balanced Budget Amendment would have done nothing. Now, sometimes I think you just have to shame the people up here, Steve. And I tried doing that last fall. There's a parliamentary option here in the House that's not available in the Senate, and very few people know about it, but I've studied the rules. It lets you rename a bill in the 3 seconds after the bill has passed. You can offer an amendment to rename the bill. So when they passed the last debt limit increase, what they did is instead of saying we're going to raise the debt limit by $1 trillion, they said we're going to forget about the debt limit for 2 years. That means this president, this House, and this Senate aren't even going to have to worry about the debt limit until after the next election. So I went to the floor as soon as the gavel went down on that, and I offered an amendment to rename that bill a bill to kick the can down the road and for other purposes. And
did you get a lot of applause for that?
I got booed. I had 62 votes. And they went around, actually, I got to give them credit. There were like 4 or 5 Democrats that voted for it because they knew it was the truth. And, and then the whip team beat it down to like 47 votes before they gavelled it out.
Well, and I'll chime in on that because Congressman Massie is exactly right. So, for example, when the Balanced Budget Amendment comes up on our side, I support it, but there's a lot of hypocrisy. Every Republican supported it, and no Democrat supported it. But that tells you something right there. The Democrats don't even support the Balanced Budget Amendment. The Republicans all support it, but the Balanced Budget Amendment on our side says you have to balance it within 5 years. The Republicans have never produced a budget since I've been here that balances in 10 years, much less 5 years. So when I actually do introduce a budget that's consistent with the Balanced Budget Amendment, mine, I try to balance them in 5 years, I get 15 to 20 votes. So really, this is the problem. It's also why elections are important, and who you get for which party in the primary can be as important as anything else. But it is important, and I think ultimately the debt's going to catch up to us. We're back to borrowing $1 trillion a year. And I'll say one other thing on this that's important is that when we cut tax rates last year, everybody said, oh, you'll make the deficit worse. But when we cut tax rates, more tax revenue actually came in. So the problem is not enough revenue. The problem is too much spending. But both Republicans and Democrats are guilty of that spending.
Yeah, I agree.
All right, we'll go ahead and go to our next question now. Mr. Richard Heights. Go ahead, Mr. Heights. You're live with Senator Paul and Congressman Massie.
Thank you, and thanks for taking my call. Senator and Mr. Congressman, my question is about some of the issues we've seen with corruption in intelligence and law enforcement. The first part of my question is, what are you currently doing to address these issues? And the second part of my question is, in your opinion, is there realistically a way to bring actual reform in these areas if for some reason we don't win the House back in the next election? Do you have a plan to address them if the conditions remain the same?
You know, this is one area where there's sometimes some bipartisan support on privacy and on whether or not the government power to spy on people. You know, like, I think the government should probably spy on people who might attack us overseas and make sure that we're defended against them, but they shouldn't spy on Americans. We should have very strict rules like the Fourth Amendment for spying on Americans. I also don't think that our intelligence community or any of these secret courts should spy on a presidential campaign like what happened to President Trump. And so there are rules we should enforce. This month, I'm going to be introducing an amendment that says the FISA court, this secret surveillance court, stands for Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court. It's supposed to spy on foreigners, people that might be terrorists or attack us. That court should not ever be allowed to spy on a presidential campaign. I'm trying to get bipartisan support for it. I'm also working with Congressman Massie, and I'll let him explain. He has an amendment that he's been working on for a couple years that's had some bipartisan support.
Well, one of the problems is the government puts backdoors in products that are made here, and it actually hurts our economy.
Like, explain to people what a backdoor into a product means.
So let's say you use, well, I don't want to, a certain phone, a certain brand of phone, right, and the government has forced that maker, that domestic United States maker of that phone, to make it easier for the government to hack into that phone. Or let's say you use an email program, and the U.S. government makes that U.S. company put a backdoor. In other words, they don't have to.
They do this so they can spy on a terrorist.
Right. But the problem is, once the backdoor is there, the government can use it to spy on anybody. And who's watching the watchers?
Right.
Well, it's this FISA court. And they signed a warrant that allowed the government to spy on everybody. Like,
right,
clearly, there's a problem at the FISA court. So we've also introduced legislation to have a privacy advocate in those FISA court, right, hearings, for instance, because when you have a courtroom and there's only one side being represented, let's say the government side that wants to spy on it, and there's not another side there. I mean, obviously, if somebody's a suspected terrorist, you can't call them up and say, who do you want to send to the court for your lawyer? But there does need to be an advocate in that court that is approving those warrants. And then anybody that gets caught spying without a warrant, I mean, they, right, need reprimanded strongly. I mean, James Clapper lied to Congress. That is a big deal, in my opinion.
And didn't you also have an amendment with Zoe Lofgren to require a warrant to look at an American's information?
Yeah. I mean, we've offered multiple amendments, and Zoe Lofgren is a representative from California who's on the other side of the aisle.
Right.
You know, Richard mentioned, what if we don't get the majority back? Well, this is a problem that's going to have to be solved on both sides of the aisle. But Zoe Lofgren is somebody that I have worked with on the other side of the aisle because she represents a district that makes electronics, that makes software and tries to sell it overseas. And it's actually bad for business. When you put government spyware in our exports, nobody overseas wants to buy that.
Right. It also turns out that the most important reason why things are very complicated so people can't break in is to protect your financial information, because it's the biggest impetus to break into a phone is to steal from you. That's how people, right, break in and they steal money, millions and millions of dollars. So it's important not to make it easy to hack into a phone because they'll steal from you.
That's what happens when the government creates a backdoor, or they create a standard like they did at NIST that's easily hackable. Well, they like those standards that are hackable because they can hack them. But the problem is then the hackers and the terrorists or money launderers find those backdoors and can exploit them as well. So we've introduced legislation to do that. The hardest thing, Richard, is to get a bill on the floor, or to get it through committee. I mean, sometimes you can get a bill through committee and they say it dies in committee. A lot of them do die in committee, but even a lot more die between committee and getting on the floor. The success that Senator Paul and I have had is typically with amendments to bills, not like unrelated amendments. We're kind of against that when people attach things to bills that don't have anything to do with the bill. But every year or every 2 years, they have to reauthorize some of these programs, like the Patriot Act. And that's when Rand did his filibuster, I think more than once. But it's also an opportunity when they know they need to pass this bill or else their legal authority for doing these programs expires. That's when we have the most leverage, and that's when we try to use the parliamentary rules to get a vote on an amendment. And so in the House, we have to work through the Rules Committee. You don't have that same problem in the Senate. But they block a lot of our legislation in the Rules Committee. Long story short, you got to know the parliamentary rules. And so as an engineer, that's my background. I look at these rules and study them and look for ways that we can get our legislation passed.
The interesting thing, though, is it also may be the best time to ever get some of these privacy things to happen, because there were many Republicans on the other side. These were the hawks that said, let the intelligence community spy on us. We don't care. If you're not doing anything wrong, you shouldn't care if the government reads all of your searches and reads all of your email. You shouldn't care if you're not doing anything wrong, which is a crazy way to live and not really, a free society if the government reads all of your material. And so many of those Republicans, though, then saw President Trump being spied on unfairly by the Obama intelligence community, and they said, oh my goodness, maybe you guys were right. We have people coming up and saying, Thomas, Rand, you guys were right. We should have, and they've switched their position. Now the question is whether or not the Democrats, who had been consistently pretty good on some of this, whether they'll stick with us. But it's one of those rare opportunities where Republicans and Democrats might come together and actually do the right thing and protect privacy.
Just one more thing. There are people who say they support the president, but they supported reauthorizing the FISA program that spied on the president.
Exactly.
I mean, there are Republicans. I can tell you, Richard, the Friday, and Rand remembers this, I'm sure, the Friday or Thursday before the Monday news release that the FISA court had been used to spy on the president, they rushed through this reauthorization. And we tried to get to the president and warn him, and Rand, I think, with some success, that this is the program. The program they're reauthorizing is the program they used to spy on you.
Right.
And then he didn't have the benefit of some more news that came out after that weekend that made it obvious that that's what they were doing.
Yeah, we got to do something about it.
So as we're going through all this, I thought I would remind everyone about the poll.
Okay.
We have the poll going on. I'm going to give a quick update. I'm going to let you guys guess first. What do you think the results are?
I'm thinking people are for the Second Amendment and letting counties be sanctuaries for the Second Amendment.
My gosh, that was such a difficult question. Yes, 84% so far.
I wrote
yes.
80-20. So you've got 84.
Wow, that's very close. 84 to 16%.
Good.
And I wanted to ask you, there was someone on the line that they dropped off, but they had a question about the legality of red flag laws. I wanted to see, Congressman Massie, if you could address that.
Well, it depends on the implementation of the red flag law. Some of them are worse than others. And this is something that I believe should be handled at the state level. If a state wants to do this, they can do it at the state level. I don't think the federal government should be mandating this. The way the federal government mandates it is through funding. So what the federal government would like to do is create a standard, maybe not this federal government sitting here, but a standard for red flag laws that all states adopt, and then they use the money to get them to adopt a standard. So there's some states where it's clearly unconstitutional, the red flag laws, like in Colorado, I believe. But there are, at the other end of the spectrum, there are laws in all 50 states already that if somebody needs psychiatric help, they can go in and commit that person for 3 days. The difference between those laws that are on the books and an onerous red flag law, for instance, like in Colorado, is the ones that are on the books, even right now in Kentucky, help the person who may be having mental issues and who may be a danger to themselves or others, whereas some of the red flag laws that are proposed just go in and sort of throw gasoline on a volatile situation.
And another way to look at it, because I do want to prevent violent people from committing violent acts. And another way to look at it, though, is already we have a law that says, and I believe I don't know if it's state law or federal, but if you commit a felony, you can't own a gun. Is that a federal?
Yeah.
So there's a federal law on that. But also, there's no reason the states couldn't get involved with that. But so we've decided that. So if states decide there are some crimes other than felonies, or that they want to make felonies, but basically if you're convicted in a court and you have a felony, you shouldn't have a gun. And so like the Parkland shooter that was so horrific recently that got the whole country sort of upset about this. This was a really rotten kid, but I'll bet he had already committed 5 or 6 felonies. The problem was the police weren't doing their job there. And after you see that sheriff interviewed and how he's just a big gun control advocate, and that he had he had 1,000 deputies and this enormous budget, but they were called 23 times to this kid's house, and I'll bet you he committed 6 felonies, but everybody kept passing him through the cracks. They mainstreamed him, and he ended up committing this horrific act. But probably the existing laws, had they been appropriately enforced, could have taken his gun rights away from him after he was convicted of a felony.
Mm-hmm. By the way, you mentioned a sheriff who had maybe 1,000 deputies. There's probably a sheriff in Virginia that's going to end up with 1,000 deputies. They won't be paid, but he's proposed that as a solution to the onerous gun laws in Virginia. If
he's going to deputize
everybody that wants to carry concealed if the state legislature takes away the right. So that's a very creative way.
We might need to go down there and get deputized.
I've been talking to my sheriff, but I think we're okay in Kentucky. But just to be clear, I haven't seen one of these laws that I could support. I feel like the biggest problem is really not the Second Amendment violation, but maybe the Fourth Amendment as well.
Yeah. Maybe one more.
We want to do, sure, let's do one more here. And Mr. David Cooper, who is one of your constituents.
Finally, we've had an Andy Barr constituent and a Brett Guthrie constituent.
So I don't know what he's been chatting me and Facebooking me. So David, you are live with the senator and with Congressman Massie. Go ahead.
Good afternoon, gentlemen. Thank you for having this town hall.
Thank you.
Absolutely, David.
You're both doing a great job representing the Commonwealth, and I know many of us appreciate it. First, thank you all for your votes that helped acquit our president. And I have 2 questions. One caller's already asked it for me. I'm actually about to deploy to CENTCOM, and for OPSEC and family protection, I can't say where I'm going, and I know you guys understand that.
Yep.
But you just talked about your penny plan, and I was wondering, because someone's already asked my other question, when will that bill be voted on, and when will your other bill be voted on about the for however many pages it is, that many days to read it, and then it can be voted on?
Yeah. Those are 2 of my favorite sort of plans. The penny plan I've had a couple votes on. I haven't won. That's why you haven't heard that much about it. I get somewhere between 15. I might have gotten 24 votes for it. And they're all Republicans, no Democrats. But that means about 30 some odd Republicans vote against it. So the penny plan has never passed. And actually, I've been trying for 5 years, and now it's actually, we call it the 2 penny plan, because it now takes 2% cut to balance in 5 years. And the other one was that we ought to, if a bill's 1,000 pages, we ought to wait 1,000 days. Which was a big bill that I came about and thought about with Obamacare, but then some of these crazy budgets that Thomas has seen, sometimes they'll give you a 2,000-page bill, and one time I think I went chasing one of them with my copy machine, trying to find it, and they were hiding it somewhere in the basement of the House. Those congressmen, they were hiding the bill somewhere, and I was knocking on doors. It was actually kind of comic. But when we found it, it was this big, and they gave us a couple hours to read it, and it's infuriating, and it's not a good way to pass legislation. It's not good government. So I said, 2,000 pages, let's wait 2,000 days to read the bill. Maybe, it kind of goes back to, remember when Nancy Pelosi said about the health care, you can read it afterwards to find out what's in it. That's just so insulting.
First of all, David, thank you for your service to the country, and I can appreciate the OPSEC sensitivity there. I would just say, if we could just get the people up here to follow the rules they've written, we'd be in a lot better shape. So for instance, here's what I'm talking about. The omnibus bill is really 12 bills stuck together. And then once they know it's going to pass, they glom other things onto the omnibus bill. So, for instance, people, including the president, would like to have a line item veto. People think that, if he could go in and do a rifle shot and eliminate some bad stuff in the bill, that we could end up with better bills. Well, that's already passed, but the Supreme Court struck it down. But what I tell people is, if we would get out of the habit of passing omnibus bills and we would do our 12 separate appropriations bills like our rules call for, like our committee structures are set up to do, like the Appropriations Committee has 12 different subcommittees, each of them responsible for one of these bills. If we would do it that way, then when we get to the end of the fiscal year and we have to refund government again, if there's a bill that the president doesn't like, if there's one appropriations bill, he could veto that, and he would only be stopping 1/12 of the government, right? 11/12 of the government would still go on. Like the monuments could still happen, the military could be funded,
right.
and because those are in separate bills. So just forcing our colleagues to follow the rules that they have here would be a tremendous victory. And so some of these battles aren't going to be fought necessarily in terms of getting a vote on a new piece of legislation. It may be in our conference committees, which happen in the House. They happen in the basement every Monday that we come to Congress. It's like getting your colleagues to find their own will to follow their own rules.
So when Congressman Massie mentioned obeying our own rules, it reminded me of we have passed over time these rules to try to say, if you have new spending, it has to be offset by some cuts in spending. Went by various names, pay-go rules, Graham-Rudman-Hollings. There were all these great reforms, and if we had ever paid attention to them and obeyed them, we would probably have a balanced budget now. But you know what they do? In every big, enormous omnibus or 2,000-page bill, there's always a line in there that says, we are exempting ourselves from these rules. And so sometimes I make them vote on it. There was a rule on that with the tax cut. And I said, well, that's fine. People were complaining the tax cut will add to the deficit. So I said, for every bit of deficit it would add, we had to cut some spending. And I got like 4 people to vote with me, 3 voted with me. There's only 4 of us total. Another way to look at it with obeying rules, this would be a new rule, and it's another way of looking at the penny plan, is I have a shutdown prevention bill, which says if we don't come to an agreement, what we do is we spend 99% of last year for 120 days. If we still don't come to agreement, then we spend 98% of what we spent last year, and just keep working your way down until they finally get the message that they're going to have to do something about it. But typically, whenever an idea comes up like that, somebody else comes up with an idea and says, it'll be so hard. We can't cut 1%. And so we'll increase 1% or something, or, we'll increase 4%. It's like ridiculous. And it's like, I'm not even for that anymore. If you're going to actually have it automatically increase the budget. And then Democrats won't vote for any shutdown prevention bill that goes below the baseline. So the baseline isn't flat. The baseline spending is going up about 5 or 6% a year. And so, that's crazy. That's the problem. I'm not voting to continue the baseline, not to shut down government. And so anyway, we try, and we got to keep trying because it's worth it. I mean, we live in the greatest country ever in the history of mankind. There's never, ever been a better time to be alive. I mean, Kentucky's doing great. I travel across the state, low unemployment. I mean, it's a wonderful time to be alive. And I think a lot of it is because President Trump and a Republican House and a Republican Senate voted to let you keep more of your money. And so I think we're in a good shape right now.
And reduce regulations.
Yeah.
I mean, you can trace back that great State of the Union speech that we both were in the chamber for last week to things that we did in the House and the Senate and that the president signed and took the lead on, like rolling back some of these regulations and reducing taxes. That's why your 401k is going up. That is why unemployment is going down. And that will push wages up as well. And so, those are direct results of things that we have done, and I think the American people are seeing that.
Well, we're going to wind up. Really enjoyed this. My friend Thomas Massie's been with me tonight. I think he's one of the best ones over in the House. He's doing a great job for us, and great job for Kentucky. And I was glad we were able to do this. Maybe we'll do this again sometime. This way I don't have to talk as much. I get to split up half the talking. We did several questions, but we'll do it again. And if you've been signed up through Facebook or email, we'll send you a notification when we're going to do this again.
senators do like to talk, so I'm pleasantly
Yeah, you got to
surprised
work your way in. You know,
that I got
so.
a word in edgewise here. You've been very generous to yield me time. I just want to remind constituents the best way to get a hold of your congressman or senator is to pick up the phone and call. Like, people are wondering, should I fax something? Yeah, we still got fax machines somewhere. And you could send an email, but I really think picking up the phone and talking to one of our staffers, whether it's because you need something solved at the VA or the IRS or at the Social Security Administration, or maybe it's because there's a piece of legislation that you want us to co-sponsor, I really do believe the most effective way is to pick up the phone and call. It takes less time than a letter, and long distance is almost free now. So I would encourage people to call my office and call Senator Paul's office for anything.
Yep, before we get out, the poll results have stayed the same.
Okay.
They're still 84-16. And just another reminder to everyone, paul.senate.gov/live. That's where you can sign up to get a notification. You'll never miss a single one of these. And you can also go to our Facebook page where we've been streaming this live. So if you missed it, your friends or family missed it, they can watch it tomorrow, the next day, every day. Because who doesn't love a lot of liberty?
And if I could just plug my Twitter account, look for hashtag Sassy with Massie. Sassy spelled S-A-S-S-Y, and Massie is spelled M-A-S-S-I-E. Would love to have you as a follower on Twitter. The phone number for my office is 859-426-0080. If you have issues with the federal government and you want us to help you cut through the red tape, give us a phone call.
Sounds good. Thanks, everybody.